The deadline has now come and gone. 10 of those witnesses are engaging with the Select Committee and are expected to substantially comply with those subpoenas. One person has not, former White House official Steve Bannon. In light of Mr. Bannon's stonewalling, the Select Committee considered a report last night and unanimously recommended the whole House vote to make a criminal contempt referral. It was a unanimous, bipartisan vote. Today, we are considering that measure so it can be debated on the House floor. If it passes, as I hope it does, the matter would then be referred to the Justice Department for prosecution. Look, I don't know if Steve Bannon has something to hide or if he's just trying to puff up the former president's ego by defending his frivolous lawsuit against the Select Committee. But I do know this. This isn't about whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. This isn't about whether you like Donald Trump or not. The Select Committee is examining the planning and execution of a violent attack on the United States Capitol in an attempt to overturn an election. This is about whether someone is above the law in the United States of America, and whether we are going to tolerate someone ignoring a lawfully issued congressional subpoena. The answer should be a clear and resounding no. Our very democracy was attacked that day, and the peaceful transfer of power was disrupted. No member of Congress should stand idly by, and certainly no one should prioritize the ego of one man over the oath every one of us took to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. I thank the entire Select Committee for its important work. I especially want to recognize the courage of Ranking Member Cheney and Congressman Kinzinger. They have taken on some pretty strong headwinds, standing up to many in their own party, from the minority leader to the former president. They have put country above party and made this effort truly bipartisan, as it should be, and we are grateful for their leadership. Now let me turn to our ranking member for any comments he wishes to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sadly, we're here today on an item to further the House majority's political agenda, a contempt of Congress resolution. Unfortunately, this resolution comes to us as the result of an inherently political process driven by an inherently political Select Committee. Today's action is unusual, to say the least. One of the fundamental questions we should all ask is, should Congress be investigating a private citizen? Certainly the House has held people in contempt of Congress in the past, but the last time Congress did what the majority is intending to do today was in 1986. Criminal contempt, as opposed to civil contempt, is an inherently punitive measure, which means it will not help the Select Committee get the documents or testimony they claim to seek, regardless of what my colleagues on the other side believe. Today's events were sadly foreseeable. It was clear when Speaker Pelosi created the committee and unilaterally blocked Leader McCarthy's appointments of Republican members that her goal was to ensure that only her chosen narrative was told. A sad state of affairs, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd now like to welcome our witnesses to provide testimony on a resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find Stephen K. Bannon in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with a subpoena duly issued by the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Cheney, we are delighted that you are here. I now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Chairman Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cole, and members of the committee. Last evening, the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol made a unanimous recommendation that the House of Representatives cite Stephen K. Bannon for criminal contempt of Congress and refer him to the Justice Department for prosecution. I'm here this morning urging that the House quickly consider the resolution holding Mr. Bannon in contempt. It's regrettable that the Select Committee and the House have been put in this position, but instead of complying with our probe, Mr. Bannon has chosen the path of total defiance. That's just not acceptable. The Select Committee's job is to get a full accounting of the violence of January 6th and the causes that led to that day. We're working hard to get answers for the American people about that attack on our democracy. We are tasked to help ensure we never see another day like that ever again by making recommendations for legislation and other actions that will help strengthen the guardrails of our democracy. And when we seek information from a witness, it's because we have good reason to think that person knows something that will help us answer those questions. We seek the facts so we make sound legislative recommendations. That's why we wanted to hear from Mr. Bannon. Since January 6th, there has been a good deal of public reporting about his involvement in events surrounding January 6th. His own comments have suggested the same thing. All hell is going to break loose tomorrow, he said in his podcast. It's not going to happen like you think it's going to happen. All I can say is strap in. You made this happen, and tomorrow it's game day. So strap in. The record goes on and on. It appears from reporting that he was involved in the so-called Stop the Steal campaign from the get-go. He was part of a war room that met at the Willard Hotel the night before the January 6th attack. And Mr. Bannon reportedly spoke with President Trump several times in the days and weeks leading up to the January 6th attack. He apparently encouraged the president to try to interfere with the electoral vote count. It appears that these events are all closely tied to the riot that erupted on January 6th. We need to understand everything about them. We need the full context. We're not asking to talk to Steve Bannon on a whim. We're doing it because we believe he has firsthand specific knowledge that the Congress needs to have to conduct our investigation. Further, the American people deserve to hear from Mr. Bannon under oath. That's why on September 23rd, we issued a subpoena to Mr. Bannon for records and deposition testimony. Through his lawyer, Mr. Bannon told us that he wouldn't comply. No records, no testimony, nothing. Instead, he hid behind vague claims of executive privilege purportedly made by the former president. Here's the thing. The former president hadn't made any claim of privilege to the Select Committee, but beyond that, there's no reasonable argument that what the Select Committee seeks from him is the type of information executive privilege would reach. What we want to learn from Mr. Bannon concerns his knowledge and conduct as a private citizen relating to a broad range of topics that do not involve discussion of official government matters with the president or his close advisors. The law is clear that executive privilege does not extend to communications between the president and private citizens about non-governmental business or between private citizens. And even if executive privilege reaches certain documents or testimony, which is not the case here, Mr. Bannon certainly does not enjoy absolute immunity from appearing before the Select Committee. The law is clear that even top White House aides who advise the president on official government matters are not immune from compelled congressional process. We conveyed all this to Mr. Bannon. 2 times we went back to Mr. Bannon's lawyer in writing, telling him that the alleged privilege claims didn't have a leg to stand on, and that if he didn't change course, Mr. Bannon risked a criminal contempt referral. We warned him what was coming, and he still defied our subpoena entirely. So it's up to Mr. Bannon, who has taken us down this path. We didn't choose to end up here, but here we are, and we cannot allow him to defy our subpoena with impunity. Indeed, Congress cannot permit this. This institution, the House, cannot let this conduct stand. Doing so deprive our investigation of valuable information. It would send a signal to Mr. Bannon that Mr. Bannon can act like he's above the law and get away with it, and with damage to this institution, the House of Representatives, by setting a dangerous precedent, giving witnesses a green light to ignore our investigative authority. I ask all members of the committee to support moving this resolution forward I'm happy to take your questions, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to recognize the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Vice Chair Cheney.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cole, Rules Committee members. We've been through a lot together. We're not just colleagues, we're friends. And I've served with a number of you on this committee for 2 years when we were in the majority. I could not have imagined then that we would meet again like this. A year ago today, the election was still a couple of weeks off. We all knew that it would be a tight race, but none of us, I imagine, anticipated that President Trump, or any president, frankly, would simply reject the outcome of that vote. Of course, President Trump had the right to challenge the outcome in our state and federal courts, which have an appropriate and constitutional role in resolving election claims. But what he did thereafter had no precedent in our history. He rejected the court's rulings in dozens of cases, including the rulings of judges President Trump himself appointed. He rejected what his own Department of Justice officials told him over and over again, that they found no evidence of widespread fraud sufficient to overcome the election results. He rejected the conclusions of both the Department of Justice and the intelligence community when they told him that the Dominion voting machines had not secretly changed the outcome of the election. President Trump had no factual or constitutional basis for his claims, and the lawyers he found who would carry his fraud claims forward have paid the consequences. Rudy Giuliani's license to practice law has been suspended, and Sidney Powell has been sanctioned by a federal judge. But Donald Trump persisted, attempting through every manner he could imagine to try to change the outcome. And we all saw what happened. The people who attacked this building told us, continue to tell us, on video, on social media, and now before the federal courts, exactly what motivated them. They believed what Donald Trump said, that the election was stolen and that they needed to take action. The Select Committee has critical work to do to get all of the details, and today we are here to address one witness, Steve Bannon. I urge you all to watch what Steve Bannon said on his podcast on January 5th. The chairman just quoted parts of it, and it is shocking. He said, "All hell is going to break loose tomorrow. We are coming in right over the target. This is the point of attack we have always wanted." He said all hell would break loose on January 6th, and he was right. Ask the over 140 Capitol police officers who fought for hours and were injured. And there is no doubt that Steve Bannon knows far more than he says on that video. The American people deserve to know what happened. They deserve to hear him answer these questions. Mr. Bannon has written to us suggesting that he's relying on the fact that President Trump wishes to assert executive privilege for his communications with Bannon regarding the planning for January 6th. We do not believe any such privilege claims are appropriate, and even if such privilege existed, it is still not absolute or unqualified. We are confident that we will prevail on these privilege issues. But there is a more important and more fundamental point here. The vast majority of what we need from Mr. Bannon is not even conceivably subject to an executive privilege claim. Mr. Bannon is using privilege as a pretext for not appearing at all and for producing absolutely no documents of any kind. That puts this institution's authority at significant risk, not just here and now, but in all future investigations. Criminal contempt is the appropriate response in these circumstances. At this moment, it is not just the institution of Congress's authority that is at stake. The potential harm to the foundation of our republic is far more significant. In the past week, President Trump has openly urged millions of Republican voters not to vote in 2022 or 2024. He's urging them to abandon our democratic system based on what every one of us knows are false claims about systemic fraud and Dominion voting machines. Let me address my Republican colleagues specifically. I've heard from a number of my colleagues in the last several days who say they, quote, just don't want this target on their back. They're just trying to keep their heads down. They don't want to anger Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader, who has been especially active in attempting to block the investigation of events of January 6th, despite the fact that he clearly called for such a commission the week after the attack. I ask each one of you to step back from the brink. I urge you to do what you know is right, to think of the long arc of history. We are told that it bends towards justice, but it does so only because of the actions of men and women in positions of public trust. In many nations, democracy has failed because those with authority would not act to protect it, because they sat in silence. History will judge those of us in positions of public trust. Remember that as you cast your votes, as you think about how you will answer when history asks, what did you do when Congress was attacked? When a mob, provoked by a president, tried to use violence to stop us from carrying out our constitutional duty to count electoral votes? When a mob, provoked by a president, tried to overturn the results of an election? Will you be able to say you did everything possible to ensure Americans got the truth about those events? Or did you look away? Did you make partisan excuses and accept the unacceptable? This contempt citation is crucial to our investigation. Witnesses cannot simply ignore congressional subpoenas when they prefer not to attend. We must do everything possible to understand that dark day in our history and to ensure, through potential legislative and other actions, that such a thing never happens again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Vice Chair Cheney and Chairman Thompson, for your very powerful statements. I think what you are requesting here is absolutely necessary. I think most people in this country are puzzled why it's so difficult to get some of these people to come before the Select Committee and testify, and they're wondering whether or not Congress will put some teeth into its enforcement rules to be able to compel people who may have been involved in this terrible, terrible action on January 6th to come before the Congress and tell the truth. I just want to ask you both to react to something. The ranking member began by talking about this as a political partisan exercise. And I just want to state for the record, the Homeland Security Committee actually, in a bipartisan way, came up with a truly bipartisan select committee, a commission. It is everything that my friends on the other side of the aisle had requested, they basically got. You know, equal representation on the committee, you know, equal say in subpoena authority. And I thought that because of that incredible bipartisan cooperation, Chairman Thompson, on your committee, that there would be a unanimous vote to approve the committee, and we could then move on. But what happened was the former president didn't like it, and all of a sudden the majority of support on the Republican side evaporated. So to say that this has been a political exercise when every effort has been made to try to present this in the most balanced, bipartisan, nonpartisan way possible, it's just wrong. I mean, it's not factual. And I have great respect for all my colleagues on the Republican side, but every single one of them voted no on the creation of this select committee, and then to say that it is somehow partisan or political now, it is frustrating, and it is not, to me, an accurate telling of the history of what is happening. But I want to yield to both of you to see whether you have any comments on that.
Well, thank you, Chairman McGovern. I was tasked with the responsibility of trying to negotiate with the minority and coming up with a bipartisan committee. For several months, I negotiated with my ranking member, John Katko from New York. We went back and forth with language, composition, and in my mind, met every consideration the minority leader put before us, and in writing. And so at the last moment, when we all thought we had agreement, and actually took it to the floor, we saw the opposition to what we thought had been an agreement between a bipartisan agreement. The unfortunate situation we find ourselves in is all of us saw what happened on January 6th. I hope no one, not just this committee, but anyone who saw what happened has anything other than total disgust for what happened to this institution and this government that all of us have sworn to defend. And so when my wife and others called me on that day wanting to know what happened, I was in the gallery. And because of that, I was really immune from some of the activities in the beginning, but I just felt that as chair of the Homeland Security Committee, who has some responsibility for defending this government from domestic as well as foreign terrorists, that act itself required me to do something. And so we, to the chagrin of some of my colleagues who said, well, I think you're being too generous in coming up with an even bipartisan commission, I said, well, look, it's not about Democrat, it's not about Republican, we have to move forward. And so we came, and I was disappointed that the minority leader and the other Republican leadership, for the most part, went against it. It was a sad day. It was an opportunity, but we had 36 people on the Republican side who voted for it. Many of them have taken and had a severe price paid because of that. That's unfortunate, because what happened on January 6th was a bad day for this country. I hope no one on this committee, or for that matter, no one in this body, try to defend the illegal, unconstitutional acts that occurred on this day. It's a bad mark. And so we're tasked with the responsibility of coming up and crafting a solution. I thank my vice chair for her strong support, but it's not about Democrat or Republican. It's about what are we going to do to prevent this act from ever happening again. I'm a grandfather. I don't know what I can tell my grandchildren if we don't do something as members of Congress to say that you can be assured, Gina or Thomas, that this won't ever happen again. And so, as a member of Congress, I feel obligated to present this. I'm honored that Speaker Pelosi designated me the chair, but I can assure you that the patriots who make up this committee have given their all toward the value of this product. And so that's where we are, Mr. Chair. It's a place that I wish that had January 6th not occurred, we wouldn't have to be here. But unfortunately, it occurred. And so we have to address it. And sometimes you address things that are not popular, but we're sworn to do our duty. And I think what you have before you today is the beginning of that product of this 9-member committee doing the duties that we're sworn to do.
Vice Chair Cheney?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Thompson. I do think it's important to note, as you did, that the initial proposal, which I think we all agree would have been the right outcome, was to look at what has happened after most of the major crises that have faced our nation, starting with the attack on Pearl Harbor, the assassination of President Kennedy, the attacks of 9/11. And that was to propose a bipartisan external commission that Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, worked on very diligently. And the idea that you would have equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats, people who weren't currently members of Congress, who were set aside, who could focus entirely on what happened, like the 9/11 Commission, the lessons learned from that day, the lessons learned from the aftermath of the election. That was the right approach. It was a preferable approach. But we have to be honest and recognize it was Republicans who killed that. As the chairman mentioned, there were, I think, 35 or 36 of us who supported it. It passed in the House, but ultimately in the Senate, it was the Republicans, despite the tremendous efforts from a number of Republicans like Senator Susan Collins and others, who really worked to try to address any concerns that could have been legitimate. But once it became clear we weren't going to have that outside commission, then the choice is, are you going to have an investigation into what happened, or are you going to let the worst attack on this Capitol since 1814, an attack that was an effort that came in the middle of our counting of electoral votes, an effort to stop that counting, are you going to let that go uninvestigated? And we certainly can't do that. So the idea that we're in a position now where at every step, the efforts of the members of this body to understand what happened are being blocked. There are efforts underway to block them. There are efforts underway to play politics. There simply comes a moment, Mr. Chairman, where we all have to say this isn't about politics. And if we want to defend this institution, if we want to defend the Constitution, then we have to be willing to work together to do what's necessary to get to the truth. And this subpoena that we've issued for Mr. Bannon is fundamental to that. His refusal to cooperate in any way also must be met with consequences. And that is exactly what we're here, what we're asking for today.
Thank you. Mr. Cole?
No questions.
Ms. Torres?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to take this opportunity to thank our witnesses for being here with us. Several of us were here in the chamber on January 6th. On the balcony, I think we will forever be tied to that horrific event. We know the horrors that occurred that day, and we carry those scars still today. We know the danger that our democracy was in. We know how close we were to losing not just our lives, but our democracy. Mr. Chairman, I want to read, for the record, a short message that I wrote I requested a flag that was flown over the Capitol on January 20th, Inauguration Day. This is a message I wrote for my grandson. At the request of the Honorable Norma J. Torres, Member of Congress, this flag was flown in honor of the date of January 6, 2021. the U.S. Capitol was attacked by insurrectionists trying to overturn the 2020 presidential election. Despite that attempt coup, this American flag flew proudly over the Capitol dome as President Joseph R. Biden and Vice President Kamala D. Harris were inaugurated. In one of our democracy's darkest hours, I fought to make sure that it would endure. I hope that you never experience anything similar, but if you do, remember that you have the power to keep it safe. Cherish the democracy that you inherit and protect it so that one day you too can pass freedoms and the right to vote on to the next generation. Congresswoman Cheney, you and I were colleagues on this committee. Every single vote, every single day, I voted against you.
Not personally.
Not personally, but, our positions and beliefs couldn't be further apart. But I am so proud, to call you a colleague, that you are trying like the rest of us to figure out what happened, what went wrong, who was responsible for trying to hang our vice president. Like him or not, he was our vice president at the time when they were trying to hang him, to kill members of Congress, to stop our democracy. This is not about red or blue. This is not about Republicans or Democrats. This is about the future of our democracy, the rule of law. We either stand in support of the laws that we put forward, vote on, and demand the rest of the country, our constituents, to abide by, or we don't. We can't cover up something so horrific. People died that day. People were viciously attacked. It is not courageous to try to cover up that crime of cover-up. We need answers. This is one way that we are trying to find answers. So I just want to thank you for your courage to uphold our democracy. And I think that this country will forever owe you for that. And I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thank you. Just a couple thoughts. 6 months or so ago, Mr. Chairman, you were here with Mr. Katko presenting the commission to us. And we all supported it and, ruled the day, January 6th, that we'd have to create that commission. But it clearly was bipartisan, and Mr. Katko supported it, and not enthusiastically. Nobody could be enthusiastic about the chore that was ahead of them, but certainly felt that everybody had worked together in good faith to find out the truth. And so I clearly supported it at that time. And the fact is that I just want to echo what Norma had to say about the honor and the courage that you two and your committee is bringing to the country. That I'm a partisan Democrat. I think our values are, the right ones for the people of America, but, obviously there's a difference of opinion. But the thing that I think is so important, and Representative Cheney, you mentioned it, is your defense of the Constitution, the defense of this institution, and the defense of the rule of law, which Mr. Bannon's decision to completely ignore the power of the Congress and its need for the truth. I mean, this subpoena and your decision to, pursue criminal contempt is right, because there's nothing more that could be at stake than our democracy and this institution and how it works with the administration. And then at the bottom of all of it is the defense of rule of law. If we don't have the rule of law, we have a rule of tyrant, we're in real trouble. So you two, I don't have any questions. I just thank you for your honor to the institution, and I thank you for your personal courage.
Thank you. Mr. Eschenthal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I'd like to just associate my remarks with that, of course, of the ranking member. Thank the witnesses for coming today, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to begin also by saluting the profound constitutional patriotism of these two witnesses. Chairman Thompson, you negotiated an agreement for an outside independent commission along the lines of the 9/11 Commission that didn't make everybody in the Democratic caucus happy. Instead of mirroring the exact numbers within the House, it was 50-50. It was 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, equal subpoena power, straight down the middle for an independent commission. And you also said, correct me if I'm wrong, no politicians allowed. No members of Congress could be on it. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I know you took some heat for that, but it was that important to you to establish this commission, and it was agreed to by Mr. Katko, who was the emissary of the minority leader, Mr. McCarthy. And both of you were stunned and astonished when they turned around, apparently at the behest of Donald Trump, and then decided that they were going to oppose it afterward. At that point, we had no alternative, as the Speaker said, other than to create a select committee. And we have a bipartisan select committee that is going to get to the bottom of this worst attack on the U.S. Capitol and the Congress since the War of 1812. This event that, for the first time in the history of the United States of America, interrupted the counting of Electoral College votes for many hours, destabilized our constitutional process, and put the whole democracy into peril. It also wounded or injured more than 140 of our police officers with broken noses, broken jaws, lost fingers, traumatic brain injuries. I have constituents who defend us every day at the Capitol who are still injured, still in physical therapy or mental health therapy because of what took place on that day. And I want to thank you, Ms. Cheney. You are a model constitutional patriot, and I think you've recovered for us an understanding that's been lost in the country. You know, the Constitution doesn't mention political parties, much less a two-party system, much less two specific parties. And the historian Richard Hofstadter said we had a Constitution written against political parties. But our founders were also political realists. They understood that people disagree, and so our First Amendment allows for people to get into political parties. But our best leaders have always tried to rise above it, you know? Jefferson said, if I could only go to heaven with a political party, I would prefer not to go. And he said at that first inaugural address, he said, we are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. Just like Lincoln said before the Civil War, we are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Just like President Obama said, we are not the red states of America or the blue states of America, we're the United States of America. And we know how to be nonpartisan when we want to be. That's how we run our constituent service offices. You call my office and you need help on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, PPP, whatever. We don't ask you, are you a Democrat, a Republican, independent, green, or whatever. We just said, you live in my district, and then we go to work for you. That's the spirit that both of you are modeling for America right now. You're going to work for the American people because our democracy will not survive if we license political coups and violent insurrections at the time of the peaceful transfer of power. This was a lethally dangerous moment for our republic. And so you're here today simply for the enforcement of a subpoena. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask you, have most people responded to the overtures of our committee? Most people responded to our subpoenas, or are most people doing what Steve Bannon is doing, which is just to blow off the committee?
Thank you very much, Mr. Raskin. At this point, Mr. Bannon is the only person that the committee has subpoenaed to come before it that has totally ignored the process.
Okay, and there is no privilege or exception, as far as you know, for someone who is friends with a former president, is there?
No.
He's subject to the law just like every other American, right?
Absolutely.
Ms. Cheney, you mentioned some of the reasons why the committee is so interested to receive all the relevant evidence that's within Steve Bannon's possession. You said he went and he addressed supporters on January 5th, the night before. He said, all hell is going to break loose tomorrow. We're coming in right over the target now. What are some of the kinds of evidence you think Steve Bannon might have that will help us to illuminate what took place on January 6th?
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Raskin. I think that the question of what did he mean, what was his involvement, what was his intent, what was his role in any of the planning of the activities of that day, to what extent was he engaged with others, either those who were planning the rally or those who may have been in the administration. We need to understand how it happened. And again, this is not just the members of the committee suggesting that people were in the Capitol because they were motivated and provoked by the President of the United States. The people who were in the Capitol have been saying that themselves, and you can read it in the pleadings. And I think it's critically important for us to recognize and understand how the language that the President Trump continues to use to this day sparked what we saw happen on the 6th. There's a much larger story that we need to understand about exactly what the plans were for that day. They went so far beyond the president's legitimate right to challenge the results of the election through our court system. He took advantage of that right, as he had a right to do. But once the courts decided, you can disagree. You can say you think the court got it wrong, but you can't ignore it. And if you ignore the rulings of our courts, then you're at war with the rule of law and you're at war with the Constitution, and that cannot be allowed to stand. It will unravel the republic.
Ms. Cheney, I know that you're a very fine lawyer. Do you agree that Steve Bannon has a right to assert a privilege against self-incrimination if any of the evidence that he would turn over would incriminate himself?
He does.
But he has to appear, right? We subpoenaed him to come and appear and to bring documents. He just didn't show up. He could have shown up and said, I plead the Fifth, I take the Fifth, I invoke my privilege against self-incrimination. Did he ever invoke that?
No, and your point is a very important one, that his response to our subpoena has been to say, absolutely, I will not appear, absolutely, I will produce no documents, and to base that on some vague claims of privilege that he asserts have been made by a former president. I think it's also important, as the chairman pointed out, to note that we have, in addition to people who have responded appropriately to subpoenas from the committee, we have many people who understand it's their duty as Americans to come forward, people who are reaching out to the committee, people who want to talk about what happened, who want to tell us what happened, who want to share that information because they understand all of us as Americans have got to be committed to the peaceful transfer of power. We must. It's foundational.
So you're saying it's not just a legal duty, but it's a civic honor to be able to render assistance to the representatives of the people in Congress as we determine the causes and the events of that horrific day.
Right.
All right, finally, I want to ask you just about the work of our committee for a second, and maybe if I could get both the chair and the vice chair to opine about this. The vice chair has emphasized the fact that the organizing ideology of the insurrection and the attempt to overthrow the Electoral College results was one of the big lie, the idea that the election was being stolen. The name of the rally and then the march and the takeover of the Capitol was Stop the Steal. That's what they were being told to do, go and stop the steal. And I would say that a lot of people there really believed that the election was being stolen. And yet, as Ms. Cheney emphasizes, 61 different courts, federal and state courts, including 8 judges appointed by Donald Trump himself, rejected every claim that they came forward with about electoral corruption or fraud contaminating the election result. And even today, as they continue to pursue it in frivolous, wild goose chase investigations like in Arizona, they come back empty-handed. They can't find anything. The election was not stolen. Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by more than 7 million votes. We're all in politics. Nobody likes to get beaten. Nobody likes to lose, but you don't try to attack the entire system of government and position a political party outside of the constitutional order. That's profoundly destabilizing to what we're doing. So I want to ask you both, how is the work of the committee not just about the recent past on January 6th, how is it about the future? And maybe I start with you, the vice chair, and then come to you, Mr. Chair, for the closing words.
You know, I think that there's nothing more important to our future than that we dedicate ourselves to the recognition and the commitment and the understanding that these elements of the defense of the peaceful transfer of power, the defense of the rule of law, having the kind of exchanges and debates. I mean, you know, as Mrs. Torres said, there are very significant policy debates and disagreements that we all have. And I've been in this room late at night many times, really mad at Mr. McGovern.
Nothing personal.
No, not personal, right? But there comes a moment when we have to recognize that the institutions of this republic do not defend themselves, and it requires people to defend them, and it particularly requires elected officials to defend them. And these aren't theoretical questions for any of us. These are questions about whether or not we're going to do our duty and whether or not we're going to stand up even when it's politically inconvenient. And I've been tremendously blessed and inspired by the work of this committee, by the way that the chairman is leading this committee, by the way that we are all working together, the members and the staff, to understand what happened and to do it in a way that is above politics.
Well, I think the beauty of this committee is the fact that the chair and vice chair, we probably passed each other going to vote, but beyond that, we were members of Congress. But we take the oath as members of Congress and obviously as chair and vice chair of this committee very seriously. There's nothing more sacred than our democracy. There's nothing more valuable than those of us who are tasked with the responsibility of preserving it. And so, if for no other reason, what you saw on January 6th, if it, as a member of Congress or an American, didn't make your blood boil, that we came very, very close to losing our bragging rights as the greatest democracy in the world. And so that has nothing to do with political party. That has nothing to do with anything other than the fact that you should be committed, like we are as a select committee, to coming up with a product that we can present to Congress, that if adopted, that will never ever happen again. I shudder to think that if elections at state and local level would be carried out in terms of the certification process like January 6th, we'd have absolute chaos. I came from local government. I can't imagine in my mayoral election on the night that a losing candidate would tear up City Hall. I can't imagine as a county supervisor later on in life that somebody would tear up the county courthouse. That's not who we are as Americans, and we have to stand on that. I respect the framers of the Constitution. Although they didn't put the part in there, they understood the differences. And what we are before you today, as part of that legislative branch, doing our duty. We're doing the oversight of what we've been tasked to do. And because of that, we are hampered by Steve Bannon's ignoring the legislative process. So we're here not by choice, other than the fact that he refused to cooperate. Had he cooperated, there'd be no need for us to be here. So we work hard. Probably I can say more than any other committee we've ever been on a daily basis. We pride ourselves on consensus and sharing the information and being forthright. So I can assure you the product that we produce at the end of our work will reflect the thoughts of all of us. And again, if you saw January 6th, which I know you've seen a number of times, it was not the equivalent of a Capitol tour. It was not the equivalent of anything other than the most dangerous action ever taken since the War of 1812 against our democracy. So we are obligated to have to come forward in the manner that we are before you today, and we'll, I hope, not be back again, but we won't hesitate if we have to come back.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I just want to recall the words of Senator Lindsey Graham, who said after the attack on January 6th that all of us could have died. They could have had a bomb. There were more than 800 people who entered the building outside of security without any background check. And we have all sworn a solemn oath to uphold the Constitution and this government against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I will be strongly supporting this resolution, and I yield back.
Thank you. I know Mr. Fishbach has no questions. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. Just a few comments. Chairman Thompson, I want to thank you and your committee for your work. I also appreciate your work to establish an independent commission, despite it being shot down by Republican leadership. There are moments in our country's history when we are presented with stark choices between right and wrong, and the events of January 6th have made clear that we are at such a moment. January 6th was a shocking assault on our government and the public servants who work here, and it cannot be minimized, it cannot be swept under the carpet, because the forces that inspired that attack are still stoking the fires of chaos and conspiracy, and our country may not be so lucky the next time. We need a shared understanding of history and accountability for what happened on January 6th in order for the country to unite, to move forward as one nation. And so we have to fully support the work of this committee to identify the causes of the January 6th insurrection while following the rule of law and respecting the due process rights of those under investigation. Silence or bogus claims of privilege cannot protect Mr. Bannon or anyone else from this investigation. Patriotism demands that anyone with knowledge about that dark day come forward, and patriotism demands that everyone in this Congress proactively support this investigation to the fullest extent of the law and not by standing idly by. Your committee has outlined why we need Mr. Bannon's complete testimony to fully understand the events leading up to January 6th, and his refusal to respond to a congressional subpoena is unacceptable. Mr. Bannon is a private citizen. He is not above the law, and he cannot refuse to obey a subpoena any more than you or I or any of our constituents can. Neither Mr. Bannon nor the former president have any credible legal argument to shield them from testifying. This is not a time for games or delays or distractions or abuse of the legal process or abuse of the pardon power, which have allowed the former president and his most devout supporters, including Mr. Bannon, to escape accountability thus far. This is a time for courage, the courage to protect our Constitution and American integrity. We are eternally grateful to Vice Chair Cheney and Representative Kitzinger and all the committee members, including our dear colleague, Representative Raskin, for having the courage to put loyalty to our country over partisan politics. Again, thank you, Chairman Thompson, for your work, and I strongly urge all of my colleagues to support the rule.
Thank you. Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to echo the thanks to the chair, the vice chair, and all the members of the committee for the exemplary work that you're doing. I think the Congress should be proud. I think the American public should be proud of the way that you've conducted yourself. I wanted to just, I'm not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV, so I'm at a bit of a disadvantage, but I can read. Not so well, perhaps, but I did read Title II, Section 192 of the U.S. Code, and I was just struck a little bit by the suggestion somehow that a private citizen would not be subject to it. But, Mr. Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, can you point out, because it clearly doesn't seem to be in the text, are private citizens exempt under that section of the U.S. Code?
What is that in terms of executive privilege?
No, just about, as I understood, what the ranking member said at the beginning was that that the Congress should not utilize this against a private citizen. But I don't see any section, I don't know, is there another section that applies to it that's not inherent in the language that I'm reading?
Not that I'm aware of.
No? So, in fact, a private citizen in the United States, if they had information that would be applicable here and could aid the members in the investigation, would be subject to subpoena just as anyone else would.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I'll just observe, even as it relates to executive privilege, is there a situation in which executive privilege could be invoked for the protection or in order to obscure the commission of a crime?
Well, in my opinion,
Exclusively for? In other words, that's the sole purpose of I'm sorry, I interrupted you. You were about to answer.
in my opinion, there is not that ability for someone to assert. They can assert it.
Yes.
But that doesn't give it standing in terms of law.
Yeah. But clearly, the use of executive privilege in the past by administrations, and this is one of Republicans and Democrats have asserted executive privilege, but it's not intended in any way. I don't think the courts have ever suggested that the commission of a crime is the rationale for asserting executive privilege. That's my understanding. Is that correct?
Yes, and I would also say, we believe in executive privilege. Executive privilege, it's important that presidents have the ability to get advice, input, to have discussions and conversations. The Constitution requires that. But it is also the case that executive privilege it's a qualified privilege, which means that a demonstrated showing of need, which we certainly have here and on which we believe we would clearly prevail, is sufficient to pierce that. And so the notion, in addition to that an individual can simply refuse to participate, can simply refuse to comply with a subpoena by making a broad, vague assertion of executive privilege is just simply not true. And so from our perspective, in these circumstances, if the former president wishes to make an assertion of executive privilege, he can do that. The current president has the ability then to determine whether or not he's going to sustain that. But for us, under these circumstances, Mr. Bannon's testimony is compelled, it's required, the production of documents is required, and he can't simply refuse to participate because he believes that there's a vague assertion of executive privilege that President Trump has asked him to make.
And that President Biden has already said that Mr. Bannon doesn't enjoy the executive privilege.
Yeah. And it does stretch, just our belief in the system that it would be a real stretch to suggest that any attack on the United States Capitol, any attack or insurrection, any attack on the electoral process, which is not in the furtherance of the interests of the Republic, could be used by a president or administration to assert executive privilege. It seems that it puts literally on its head the notion of asserting executive privilege, which is intended by administrations to further the interests of the American people and of the Republic. And I feel a little bit like this is, you know, the old heads I win, tails you lose. The suggestion that you can't somehow compel testimony or subpoena a private citizen, yet if you were on the public side, you would assert executive privilege. Sort of like, then there's no way of piercing this. There would be no way to get any information that might be entirely relevant to what happened on January 6th or the days leading up to it. Look, I just say this in closing. I appreciate, Mr. Chair, the opportunity for us to ask some questions of our distinguished colleagues. But, you know, what strikes me as so frustrating is on the day of January 6th and the days that followed, all sides expressed, you know, the greatest concern for what had happened. All sides, or both sides, held the president accountable, pointed to the president and the comments that he made in moments following the attack, and yet almost as many have changed their position, almost as though they use that old, you know, saying, who are you going to believe, me or your own eyes? I mean, we have, you know, we were here, we were witnesses to what happened, and so it may be inconvenient from a political perspective to keep talking about this, but boy, it seems to me politics is the last thing we ought to worry about right now. I mean, we have literally the future of this republic, which I often say, I took as an article of faith as a young man growing up in America that person who got the most votes won, that democracy would continue to survive, and that the Congress would ultimately defend the Constitution and the right of the public. I no longer take it. I don't know. I was out knocking on doors this weekend, visiting people, a lot of local races, talking to folks. I can't tell you how many people, this is really, I mean, troubling. I was talking to Republicans and Democrats, independents, everyone. I can't tell you the number of comments from people who said, I'm frightened. For the first time in my life, I'm frightened on whether we're going to make this, whether the republic will survive, whether or not we'll live in a free country. And they're not saying it because, you know, hyperbole, and they were making speeches. I was at their door. I've never heard that before. I literally never heard that before. I mean, I think we should all, it doesn't matter what political party, you can be a socialist, you can be reactionary, radical, left, right, I don't really care, center. But the idea is that people ought to be able to express themselves, participate in the process without fear that somehow the question of whether the republic will stand, whether we will defend the right of law is ever at question. And I tell you, I was shook up. I'm shook up now that this question exists, that we're actually debating whether or not an attack on the U.S. Capitol should be investigated. It seems to me like some fantasy, some dystopian world in which we live, like a bad movie I would turn off halfway through because I think, well, this could never happen. I mean, there's got to be some element of decency and honor and concern about this country moving forward. I think we're being tested perhaps as we've been tested no time since the Civil War. So I'm heartbroken that we're even here. I really am. And I'm heartbroken that, who knows, my children and my grandchildren may not live to have the same kind of security and sense of safety about our country that I had as a young man growing up. So anyway, I'll yield back, Mr. Chair, and I again want to thank the chair and vice chair and all the members of the committee for the exemplary work they're doing.
Thank you. Mr. DeSaulnier.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say how thank you to the witnesses and how grateful I am for their work and for the comments of my colleagues. And I'm grateful for the witnesses' steadfastness and their integrity. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to echo the great thanks to both the chair and the vice chair of the committee for their hard work, for their integrity, and for their dedication to this country and its institutions. Thank you for everything that you're doing. Unfortunately, we're having to have this committee meeting because now the whole House has to help you do your jobs. And this meeting is about holding people accountable to our nation's laws and to our Constitution. And former White House Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, as we know, has refused to comply with your duly issued subpoena. He refused to come voluntarily. His claim of executive privilege now, as we know, is flimsy at best. He has been a private citizen since mid-2017, having served his last executive branch duties in the immediate wake of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. His communications with former President Trump in the lead up to the January 6th attack on our democracy can hardly be considered part of any presidential official duties. Everyone must play by the rules. And Bannon has already made his fair share of trips to the well. He's already been pardoned for a series of crimes defrauding the people of the United States of America. Not this time. I urge my colleagues to support the committee, the chair, the vice chair, the rule, and the underlying resolution. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I would certainly echo the comments of my colleagues, the chair, Representative Torres, well, every one of my colleagues on this particular side of the dais today, and to thank Chairman Thompson, you, for your leadership. I think the clarity of purpose that you have brought to the committee's work. To the vice chair, I say thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your moral clarity and for your political courage. The vice chair and I have districts that share a common border, and I cannot begin to describe to you how many constituents of mine have said, when you see Representative Cheney, tell her thank you. Across the board and across the political spectrum, it is not easy, and we know that, and we thank you for the political courage that you've exhibited over the course of these last 8 months. I don't think the work that you all are doing couldn't be more important, and we all have experiences from January 6th. I was on the floor with many of you that day. I've often said that one of the proudest moments of my life was in the early morning hours of January 7th at 3:45 in the morning, being on the floor as we certified the election of 2020, being able to shake Vice President Pence's hand at the conclusion of the day's proceedings, to tell the world that the peaceful transfer of power still existed in the United States of America, as it has for the better part of the last 230 some odd years. And the work you all are doing to get to the bottom of what happened on January 6th is incredibly important, not just in terms of better understanding the past, but as Representative Raskin so eloquently put it, also for purposes of the future, and as to whether or not our country will continue to function as a constitutional republic. I have just a particular set of questions that I think are important for the record. I will say I'm not convinced that Mr. Morelli is not a lawyer, given his very compelling legal analysis that he offered earlier, which certainly I concur with. But I just think it's important for the record to get a better sense as to Mr. Bannon and his counsel's responses to your committee. So I believe that the supposed invocation of executive privilege is meritless, and I suspect the court will agree on that point. But operating on their premise, did Mr. Bannon provide any particularity with respect to documents that are supposedly protected by the executive privilege?
At this point, Mr. Bannon has not provided the committee with any documents.
No documents?
No documents.
Did Mr. Bannon produce a privilege log?
Mr. Bannon did not provide the committee any documents or any privilege request other than from his attorney who asserted comments relative to former President Trump's lawsuit, but he did not do anything representing his client.
So no documents produced, no privilege log, as is typically the case when a witness purports to invoke a privilege to essentially attest as to which documents are purportedly protected by that privilege and which are not. I understand the committee has the ability to make a variety of accommodations with respect to testimony adduced by a witness, including, for example, by interviewing witnesses. Has Mr. Bannon or his counsel agreed to an interview?
No, and we've made two separate requests of Mr. Bannon in pursuit of trying to engage Mr. Bannon and his attorney in such a conversation, but we've not been successful.
To that end, has Mr. Bannon agreed to, or his counsel, to a deposition?
No.
My understanding is that under committee rules and under the rules of the House, witnesses are able to provide, or rather, are able to have counsel join them for any kind of testimonial interview, so that they can, ultimately rely on the counsel when they're invoking a certain privilege. Has Mr. Bannon, of course, refused to agree to testify and did not show up on the date from which he was asked to testify, correct?
At this point, of all the witnesses we've subpoenaed before our committee, he is the only witness so far that's been totally uncooperative.
So no interview, no deposition, no documents, no privilege log, no testimony, just total, complete defiance of the subpoena.
That's correct.
I don't know in what universe this body could tolerate that kind of defiance of a subpoena. Irrespective of political affiliation, this is ultimately about the constitutional prerogatives of the House of Representatives as a co-equal branch of government under Article 1. And with that, Mr. Chairman, and for that reason, I will certainly be supporting the rule, and I would encourage my colleagues to do the same.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back his time. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the letter that Republican leader McCarthy sent to Speaker Pelosi. This is early on when we were talking about creating a bipartisan commission. And I want to submit it for the record because I think, this is a historical document. I want it to be accurate, that every single thing that Mr. McCarthy requested, an equal 5-5 ratio, co-equal subpoena power, no inclusion of findings or other predetermined conclusions, which ultimately should be resolved by the commission itself. Every one of these things, Mr. Thompson, was agreed to by your committee. And yet it was rejected by the majority of Republicans in the House and in the Senate. And, I think you said, Mr. Thompson, at the beginning about the gravity of this moment. You invoked your granddaughter and about the importance of making sure that we get this right so that future generations will look back and see how we behaved. And I want to commend you again for your leadership. I think you are getting this right. I think this is nobody welcomes this moment, but it is the right thing to do. And Ms. Cheney, I was a history major in college, and you remind me of Margaret Chase Smith, the Republican senator from Maine, who saw through Senator Joseph McCarthy's lies and demagoguery and stood up to his brazen attempts to use fear and intimidation to expand his own political power. That was a long time ago. But you're reminding us that the courage she exhibited still exists in America if we look inside ourselves and do the right thing. And I believe that someday history will look back to moments like this in a similar way and celebrate the honor and courage that you and Mr. Thompson and others, Mr. Raskin and others, are displaying. We got to get this right. And so, again, I thank you very much for your appearance here today. There are no other questions, so you are free to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
And I think we have another panel. Representative Jordan of Ohio, Representative Banks of Indiana, and Representative Gates of Florida. Anything you brought in writing, or submit to rules documents at mail.house.gov before the conclusion of this hearing will, without objection, be entered into the record. And I don't know who wants to go. Anybody have a preference to go first, or just since you're at the mic, Mr. Jordan, you go first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members of the Rules Committee. Earlier, Representative Cheney said we can have an investigation or we can let it go uninvestigated. I mean, what a ridiculous statement. The FBI's been investigating this issue for the past, since it happened. Exactly where it's supposed to happen. 600 people have been charged. Investigations are supposed to happen in the executive branch. Congress has an oversight function, but Democrats don't want to do that. They don't want to ask the appropriate questions, like why was the security posture so weak that day? Why wasn't the National Guard here? They don't want to ask those questions. Instead, the actions of the January 6th committee, I believe, are a complete assault on Americans' liberty. There have been 4 batches of subpoenas issued. 4 batches. The one we're talking about today, Mr. Bannon, Mr. Meadows, Mr. Patel, Mr. Scavino. Second one to Mr. Clark, employee at DOJ, former employee at DOJ. The 3rd batch to organizers of some other rally I didn't know about that happened that day. And then there's been subpoenas issued to 11 individuals, 11 American citizens, who asked the government for permission on an application to hold the Trump rally. Now think about this. They put their names on an application. The government asked them to do that. They give that application to the government granted it, and now the January 6th committee petitions them to ask them questions about exercising their First Amendment right to assemble. Here's what they ask them about. Subpoena to those individuals, those 11 individuals, includes a demand for agenda and selection of speakers for the rally. They ask them for coordination of the speakers' respective speeches, discussions of content, and they ask them, think about this, communications with or concerning any member of Congress. So, if some of these individuals happen to talk to a member of Congress exercising their First Amendment liberty to petition their government to redress their grievances, wow, the January 6th committee wants to depose them on those kind of things. Some of these individuals are 20-some-year-old staffers. I mean, this is largely a clerical thing, but they filled out this application, setting out chairs, escorting people to their seats, plugging in microphones. No, they're gonna go after them. Even though the investigation the FBI is doing says, fine, scan evidence of any type of coordination. Here's what it says: violence was not centrally coordinated. This is the Reuters story. Oh, and here's the source. Here's the source on that story. Senior lawmakers have been briefed in detail on the results of the FBI's investigation so far, find them credible. A Democrat congressional source said. So there is an investigation going on where it's supposed to happen in the executive branch. Oh, I forgot. One other thing the January 6th committee's done that I believe is a direct attack on liberty. They've sent letters to the carriers, the tech companies, asking that they, for hundreds and hundreds of Americans, according to news reports, asking that they preserve all communications of that individual for the past 6 months. And they told these companies, oh, by the way, don't let the person we're telling you to preserve information for, don't let them know, like the law requires, don't let them know that we've asked you to do this. And if you feel compelled to follow the law and tell them that this January 6th, that government is asking for this information to be preserved, if you feel compelled to, tell us first. The old gag order concept, this is scary where they want to go and what they're doing to Americans' constitutional rights. And finally, I would ask just this sort of fundamental question. How can you expect witnesses to participate when you wouldn't let Republicans participate in the committee? How can you do that? We know what this is about. This is plain and simple. This is about they got nothing else to talk about. They got nothing else to talk. This is the worst administration in history. We went from a secure border to complete chaos. Complete chaos. Every single month has been worse than the one before. March was the highest month on record for illegal crossings, illegal migrant encounters until April. April was the highest month until May. May was the highest month until June. June was the highest month until July. 212,000 that month alone. They got nothing else to talk about. We went from energy independence to the President of the United States begging OPEC to increase production. They can't talk about that. No, they're going to use this committee to attack American citizens' liberties, fundamental First Amendment rights. We went from relatively safe streets to violent crime up in every major urban area in this country. Can't talk about that, can't address those problems that real Americans care about. Nope, we're going to assault Americans' First Amendment rights. Can't talk about inflation, real wages gone down, can't talk about that, supply chain problems, empty shelves in the stores, can't talk about that. Nope, going to go after this. I hope every single Republican votes against this. I hope some Democrats decide that this is not how it's supposed to work. We just had a decision last year. The Mazur, these guys are obsessed with going after President Trump. We just had a decision in the Mazur case last year that says this is not how it's supposed to work. Slap back Congress because they wanted to get information that they weren't entitled to. They don't do the investigations, the executive branch does. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to questions.
Mr. Gates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the chance to be in the Rules Committee. I don't frequent this room, but I feel quite at home with so many of my colleagues from the Judiciary Committee also serving on this panel. Mr. Chairman, January 6th was not a good day. But to my knowledge, there's been no charge of insurrection or terrorism. Largely, the charges that have been levied against those who were involved in breaking the law result in property damage charges. And it's my expectation that if there are folks who broke the law, they should be treated no better or no worse than anyone else who breaks these particular laws. But all of this is ridiculous. Mr. Chairman, the American people are in trouble. I was recently in Qatar on a bipartisan delegation led by Mr. Issa, and we learned directly that thousands upon thousands of Afghans were let into our country with principally no vetting, no screening. The general we met with at the base in Doha said that refugees were merely handed a blank sheet of paper, and whatever they wrote on it was deemed their paper passport. And people are concerned about that. On our border, we functionally have a turnstile. I never believed that President Biden could be worse than President Obama on the border, but we've gone from the Obama days of catch and release to the Biden days of import and release, where people are being really beckoned across the border as a consequence of our policies and then shuttled around the country. And our supply chain issues have come to the forefront of the minds of so many of Americans. I mean, supply chain used to be something people learned about in economics class. And now the supply chain issues are resulting in inadequate access to things that people need. And we see the Washington Post tell Americans to just lower their expectations regarding the American economy. I was recently at the Port of Long Beach. I saw just, cargo ship after cargo ship. You could about walk from the Port of Long Beach to the Channel Islands in California without ever having your feet touch the water on cargo ships that cannot come into port because of a total failure of the U.S. economy. Our country has been humiliated abroad in Afghanistan, where reliance on this strategy of an Afghan government being left to facilitate American departure and withdrawal turned out to be a total fiction. And yet here we are reviewing Steve Bannon's podcast. The average American, when they wake up, I don't think one of the first 100 things they think about is Steve Bannon's podcast, the things he said before or after January 6th. I think that is a uniquely Washington obsession. And it wouldn't be so damaging to our country if it wasn't absorbing the capacity of the Congress to meet the actual challenges that the American people are facing. I mean, do you really think that your constituents are out there hoping that you guys are here sharing your hot takes on Steve Bannon's podcast rather than dealing with the inflation that is crushing them, the border crisis that is concerning them, the problems we have abroad? It's truly shameful that this is got the focus and the obsession of so many in the Congress. There's been discussion today about Mr. Bannon's response being one of total and complete defiance. I believe those are the words that my colleague from Colorado used. But that's not true. Mr. Bannon simply wants claims of executive privilege to be resolved. And I am not competent to resolve those questions. I don't know if those claims are meritorious or not. But I do think that a person, when presented with such demands from the January 6th committee, might reasonably want those questions to be resolved in the absence of some total and complete defiance. We saw this in the Don McGahn scenario, where once the constitutional questions and legal issues were resolved, Mr. McGahn came in and we were able to have an interview. Much has been said today about the failing institutions in America and who is to blame for them. So many of my colleagues on the left talk about Trump being this savage against our institutions and that our institutions are all going to fail because of Trump and the insurrectionist Republicans. But truly, this is a case of projection. After the 2016 election, Democrats repeatedly called President Trump an illegitimate president. They damaged the institution of our electoral process by claiming that Trump was a Russian agent. How phony and fake that all turned out to be. We've even seen the Democrats back institutions that have done great violence to our sense of justice. When the FBI was changing evidence in a secret court to go after President Trump and his allies, they certainly were able to rely on my colleagues on the left to have their back. And the US dollar is a pretty important institution to American families. And the policies being considered by the majority in this Congress would crush the dollar. It would punish savers and seniors, leading to massive inflation, getting people caught with real impact on their lives that go beyond your perception of Steve Bannon's podcast. So this week, it is the institution of Congress that is failing to meet the needs of the people. But in the prior panel, we heard Chair Thompson and Congresswoman Cheney really give up the game, because this isn't about a contempt proceeding. Everything the American people are watching today is about the inward turning of our national security apparatus and law enforcement against political rivals. Mr. Thompson, Chairman Thompson, talked about criminal contempt referrals. I would proffer to the committee that Chairman Thompson knows exactly why he made that statement, because he knows there are willing hands at the Department of Justice ready to receive such a referral and to criminalize our politics. Mr. Bannon wants to wait to see if there is a privilege issue resolved by a court, and as a consequence, this is all just theater to set up the utilization of criminal process against Steve Bannon. We also heard Congresswoman Cheney echo those very themes. In her comments regarding Leader McCarthy, someone that I don't agree with in all circumstances, Congresswoman Cheney said that Mr. McCarthy had been especially active in blocking the January 6th committee. Those words were chosen on purpose because obstructing a congressional investigation, as we all know, is a crime. And so this isn't about Mr. McCarthy's discussions, this isn't about his perspective, this isn't about his votes or his speeches. This is about setting up people like Steve Bannon and Kevin McCarthy for criminal process. And the American people need to know that has begun now. It began in that committee, and this is another step along the way to criminalize political activity. But the American people should also know it's not just the Kevin McCarthys and the Steve Bannons that are going to be targeted. It's not just going to be the powerful and the rich and the famous and people you see on TV. And the tell for that is that the federal government is going to be reviewing transactions over $600. That's what they want to do. And the whole reason that's the case is because it's not going to be an effort exclusively against those with money and power. It is going to be an effort against regular Americans to criminalize their politics. My friends, Democrats need January 6th right now more than ever. They need it because they can't pass a bill. I mean, this isn't Republicans. This was the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, and others in the Blue Dog Caucus saying, we were promised a vote on the infrastructure bill, and it is a betrayal of the trust that we have with Speaker Pelosi that that vote didn't occur. So here we are. You can't get an infrastructure bill. You can't get a reconciliation bill. You can't meet the needs of the country. The border is a mess. Afghans are coming in unvetted. The dollar is crumbling. The economy is failing. Supply chain issues are hurting Americans' families. And you desperately need to obsess about January 6th. I would suggest that you need to move on, and the American people are ready to move on. But if we are going to obsess about calls for violence, it would be important to note that there's a good amount of hypocrisy in this Democrat-led effort. For example, when Congresswoman Maxine Waters called on Democrats to physically intimidate President Trump's cabinet officials, there was no such effort for contempt or review or committees or commission. Congresswoman Waters said, let's make sure we show up wherever we have to show up. And if you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome anymore. It was a Democrat Missouri state senator who said, I hope Trump is assassinated. It was former Attorney General Eric Holder who said, no, when they go low, we kick them. referring to Republicans, physical kinetic energy against your political opponents. Speaker Pelosi called President Trump an imposter and said it is dangerous to allow the American voters to evaluate his performance in the 2020 election. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley urged unrest on the streets. She said, there needs to be unrest in the streets as long as there is unrest in our lives. We saw our country face violence and vandalism for months during the summer of 2020. Where was the commission to evaluate that unfortunate activity? In 2017, Speaker Pelosi said, our election was hijacked. There is no question. Congress has a duty to protect our democracy and follow the facts. So I guess in that case, protecting our democracy meant destabilizing the presidency. And now, all of this pomp and circumstance to preserve it. We heard Speaker Pelosi also say, quote, I'm counting down the hours till he's gone. I plan to pull him out of there by his hair, his little hands and feet. Governor Cuomo talked about physical violence that New Yorkers ought to engage in against President Trump. He said, quote, he can't have enough bodyguards to walk through New York City. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer said 86-45. Get it? Senator Warren actually sent up a meme that called for MAGA death. So again, I sense from the was that time expiring, Mr. Chairman? There's no time limit? All right, well, I'm sort of just getting, I got a little more to lean in here.
We don't have a time limit in the Rules Committee, although we should rethink it.
Hey, anytime I can inspire congressional reform, I'm always eager to do so. Again, Mr. Chairman, time and again, we see these calls for violence. We see actual violence that was far more grave and far more damaging to our country throughout the summer of 2020 than the unfortunate acts on a bad day on January 6th. And I would encourage the committee and the Congress to do what the American people have done, move on from this, and let's focus on the actual issues that affect them. And I appreciate the committee's indulgence, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jordan, when you appeared before the Rules Committee earlier this year in January, I asked you to say 5 simple words. The election was not stolen. And you were unwilling to say them then. Can you say those 5 words today?
I've never said it was stolen, Mr. Chairman. I'll give you the same answer. Never said it was. I said we should investigate it. I said on January 6th, when the electoral votes were counted, that Joe Biden is president of the United States. And if you got a problem with that, I don't understand it. The real question is why don't you guys want to investigate what happened?
You said a lot of words just now, but unfortunately, you're still unwilling to say those 5 simple words. And I think that's incredibly important. Pushing debunk conspiracy theories and
I'm not pushing any
adding
conspiracy
fuel
theories.
to the fire when it comes to
Your obsession with 5 words seems pretty ridiculous to me.
Yeah, and when this works better. I mean, I'll let you speak, and then you can let me speak, and that's the way we work it here. But we saw on January 6th how misinformation could lead some people to violence and ultimately endanger our democracy. Mr. Jordan, on July 27th, you were asked by Brett Baer on Fox News if you talked to the former president on January 6th, and you didn't give a clear answer. You said, and I quote, I've talked to the president so many, I can't remember all the days I've talked to him, but I've certainly talked to the president, end quote. The next day, on July 28th, you confirmed to Spectrum News that you spoke with the former president on January 6th. When asked by a Spectrum News reporter, Taylor Popolars, whether you spoke to the president before, during, or after the Capitol was attacked, you said, and I quote, I spoke with him that day, after, I think after. I don't know if I spoke with him in the morning or not. I just don't know. I have to get back to you. I don't know when those conversations happened, end quote. So my question is, you've had 84 days since that interview to go back and check the records. So when did you speak with the former president on January 6th? Did you talk to the former president before, during, or after the attack on the Capitol?
Of course I've talked to the president.
All 3?
Of course I've talked to the president. I've been clear about that. I talk to him all the time. This is not about me, Mr. Chairman. I know you want to make it about me. You want to make it about individuals, other individuals. But this is about the lack of a proper security presence that day. That's what this committee, if this committee is going to do something that's worthwhile, that's what they should be investigating. Of course I talked to the president. I talked to him that day. I've been clear about that. I don't recall the number of times. But it's not about me. I know You want to make it about that,
No,
but this is about the, why wasn't, how about this?
But
Why
I guess-
wasn't the National Guard here that day, Mr. Chairman?
If I could reclaim my time, I just want.
Have you asked that question? Have you asked the Speaker, why wasn't the National Guard here?
No, my question to you, I'm asking the question to you.
And I gave you the
question was,
answer.
Did you talk to the president, former president, before, during, or after the attack on the Capitol? Or was it all three? The reason why I ask is, you had 84 days since you said you couldn't remember, and you would check. So if you could just clarify the record, was it before, during, or after the attack on the
I talked to the
Capitol?
President after the attack.
So not before or during?
Right.
Okay, and you,
And I've been clear about that.
well,
But here, let me ask you a question. You brought up January 6th.
All right. But, yeah, but my understanding is that you said to a reporter from Politico that you spoke to him during. So is now after the attack, or you?
During. No, I did not speak to the President during the attack.
So you admitted to speaking to the former president on January 6th, the same day you voted to overturn the election. Facts be damned. And although you've routinely suggested that you're just another member of Congress, speaking with the president, your name comes up again and again in regards to efforts to overturn the election. There is even reporting that back on December 27th, then President Trump spoke with then acting Attorney General Jeffrey Rosen and others to discuss how to reverse Biden's win. An official who was on that call, Richard Donahue, notes you, Mr. Jordan, as a lawmaker who was referenced. This is the same meeting where President Trump told the Justice Department, according to handwritten notes by Mr. Donahue, and I quote, "Just say that the election was corrupt and, quote, leave the rest to me and our congressman." Did you discuss with President Trump a coordinated effort to overturn the results of the election?
I have no idea what you're talking about. I have no idea what that is. Of course not. But you brought up January 6th, Mr. Chairman?
What?
You brought up January 6th, and you said we tried to overturn the results of the election by simply objecting?
No, I just know he said by objecting.
Here's what I know.
Let me say, I don't know.
Okay, well, I hope I get a chance to respond at some point.
I just don't know of another member of Congress who is deeply enmeshed in all of this as you are, and apparently you're unwilling to give some of the more specific answers to this committee today. I guess, are you willing to tell the Select Committee what you know about events leading up to, during,
I've been
and
clear all
after
along.
that
I've
day?
got nothing to hide. I've been straightforward all along.
And just so you know, I mean, I'm looking here, this is a Politico story here. It quotes you, it says, "Look, I definitely spoke to the president that day. I don't recall. I know it was more than once. I just don't recall the times." This is to Olivia Beavers. And you later said that, "I'm sure that one of the Trump-involved calls took place in the safe room because we were in that room forever." I mean, that's what you...
Yeah, after the thing, that's what I said. But what does this have to do with, what does this have to do with Steve Bannon? What does this have to do with Steve Bannon's contempt?
I'm just, you...
I thought that's why we were here.
Yeah, well, in your opening, you didn't mention Steve Bannon. Mr. Gates did.
No, I mentioned, I guess I did mention Bannon's name. I mentioned him very first.
You talked about inflation.
No, I did. No, I didn't. I
I
said there are 4 batches of subpoena. The first batch, Bannon, Meadows, Patel, Scavino, first name I mentioned.
Yeah.
You got to go back. I'm sure the reporter can bring up the record.
Yeah, I think what I come away listening to your opening statement is that you're more outraged by people asking questions.
Not at all.
Than police being beaten.
I'm more outraged by the attack on
than
people's
than
First Amendment
police being
liberties.
beaten here on January 6th, and the lives of the people who work for all of us being at risk. And so,
January 6th, Mr. Chairman, can I respond to something?
Yeah, you may.
January 6, 2017, guess who the first person was to object to counting the electoral college results for Mr. Trump? Guess who it was?
It was me.
It was you. Guess which state?
Alabama.
Which state? Alabama, a state President Trump won by 30 points. So you can object to Alabama on January 6, 2017, and for 4 years, you guys can go after President Trump, the Trump-Russia investigation. You can do that for 4 years. In October of 2020, Hillary Clinton said just weeks before the election, she said the 2016 election was stolen from her. So you guys can investigate that, all based on lies, for 4 years. We're not allowed to ask questions for 4 minutes about the 2020 election. We're not allowed to object in Pennsylvania where they unconstitutionally changed their election law, but you can object to Alabama?
No, well, I'm glad you raised that issue. All right.
Mr. Raskin can object to Florida?
All right, it's my time now. So I raised the issue of Russian interference in our election. I also raised the issue of voter suppression, which was a real concern in that election. I took the action, and I said at the time, it's a symbolic action. I had no senator to join with me, but I wanted to make sure that the issue of voter suppression and potential
So it's okay for you to do it?
excuse me, please. There's a difference here. I did not organize a rally or have meetings to actually plan and undermine an election.
I didn't either.
And the Capitol wasn't attacked before I made my objection.
There's a difference. The difference being where Democrats are allowed, but Republicans
Mr. Jordan,
aren't.
if you don't want to testify here, you're free to leave.
You keep saying all kinds of things. Don't give me a chance to respond.
Seriously, I've given you a chance to respond. You won't let me get a question out.
All right, go ahead.
All right?
Ask your question.
The Capitol wasn't attacked before or after I made my objection. The Vice President wasn't rushed to a secure location. His life wasn't threatened. President Obama at the time didn't tweet out a video saying he loved rioters. There wasn't even a vote on my objection. So there's a false equivalency here as an attempt to whitewash what happened on that terrible, terrible day.
I'm not trying to
I was the
whitewash it.
last person off the floor on January 6th. And I came face to face with these people in the speaker's gallery. And I will tell you,
I was there too, Mr. Chairman.
if you want me to describe what evil looks like, it's looking to those faces, those people who, while 3 police officers were in front of the door trying to protect all of us, they were smashing the windows open to get at people. And so, the notion that there's all this outrage today over people asking questions, and there's not outrage over the fact that the police, the Capitol Police, who are here to protect us and who do protect us every day, were beaten. People lost their lives. Others' lives were threatened. The fact that somehow we asking questions about trying to figure out why did this happen, who is responsible, that somehow that is a bad thing. Give me a break. Give me a break. I mean, one of you mentioned political theater. This is not political theater, I don't know what is, but let me just say one of the most genuine statements that I have heard uttered in the Capitol was by Vice Chair Cheney, who, to her credit, is embracing the truth and asking her Republican colleagues to join with her in making sure that the questions are answered in a way so the American people know what happened, so it never, ever, ever happens again. All of us are concerned about the future of our democracy in the aftermath of what happened. We don't ever want to see that happen again. So that's what this is all about. So we could talk about inflation, we could talk about the border, you could talk about whatever you want to talk about. Fine. You're at the Rules Committee, you could talk about whatever the hell you want to talk about. But the bottom line is, I think what we're doing here today is absolutely necessary.
Can I respond?
You may.
I'm not trying to whitewash anything. Republicans have been consistent. We have condemned violence every stinking time it happened. We condemned it on January 6th, and 600 people are being prosecuted and held accountable for what they did wrong, as well they should be. But it would have been nice if you guys would have condemned the violence in the summer of 2020, instead of making statements like my colleague just read. It would have been nice, instead of the Vice President of the United States raising money to bail rioters out of jail, it would have been nice if you'd have done that. No. This double standard, you guys get to say all the things you did about Trump for 4 years. You get to have the summer of 2020 and call it peaceful protest. We condemn violence every single time. It'd have been nice if you guys had done the same. I am so sick of the double standard. Americans are so sick of the double standard.
Well, I think many of us did condemn it. I condemn violence wherever it may occur. But, let me just say this. You can yell and scream as much as you want. The bottom line is,
no, I'm not yelling and screaming.
We saw what we saw.
I'm reflecting where the American people are. They've had it with the double standard.
The American people saw.
You're allowed to object. We're not.
No, you could object. That's not the issue. Is not whether or not you raised an objection, Mr. Jordan. The issue is what transpired that day. The issue is that after all,
we had nothing to do with that.
We'll see where the investigation leads. But after all of this time, still, you cannot say those 5 words that the election was not stolen. With that, I'm happy to yield to the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Cole.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Actually, I didn't have any questions for the last panel. I don't have any questions for this panel. But I know you came here to testify, Mr. Jordan, and I just want to make sure if there's another point that you had to make, that you have the opportunity to make it. Is there any particular concern you had? And I do want to make for the record, you should not be on trial here for, you know, if somebody wants to talk to you, they can, you know, charge you with something. I guess they could do that. Or if the select committee wants to call you, I guess they could do that. But I think you're here to talk about the testimony and, you know, your view of the subpoena. So if you don't have anything to add on that, that's fine by me.
No, I mean, look, I thought this was about the subpoena. I'm concerned about what's happened to people's rights. I'm concerned about the double standard, as I've indicated. And look, as far as me personally, I talk to the president all the time. I talked to him that day. My understanding is, from my memory, I talked to him after the attack happened and we were moved to the chamber. I may have talked to him before. I don't know. But all I'm saying is that I had nothing to do with any of this. So that to me is just,
well,
you guys, they're a
again,
Democrats' obsession.
Not what we're here to determine anyway. So with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Torres.
I think the American people can see the big difference between the previous panel, Mr. Chairman, and this panel. The previous panel who is eager to get to the truth, to get to an investigation, to get to preserving our democracy, standing up, having the courage to stand up for the rule of law. It's a huge difference. It's a huge difference between hiding the truth, accepting the fact that an insurrection happened, that we almost lost our lives. Some people may not care about their lives, but I care about mine, and I care about the lives of my colleagues, all of my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats. It is unfortunate that we continue to have this discussion, because what happens here in this temple of democracy, you know, oftentimes happens outside of this U.S. Capitol. A woman was recently raped on a train. And while this woman was being violently assaulted, sexually harassed, the passengers stood there and did nothing. I stand corrected. They did something. They held up their cell phones and recorded the crime in progress. Police are investigating that. But there's more to the fact that a woman was raped, violated, assaulted in plain sight while riding a train. There's a moral issue of people just standing by and watching crimes happen and not caring about understanding what happened and how do we prevent that. I did not vote for the former president. I did not respect the former president's positions on pretty much anything. But I believe in the rule of law. And I went to the inauguration because it was my duty to do that. It is unfortunate that we have to look at the moral character of how people deny and try to twist the truth around what happened. People died. This is not about somebody being sexually assaulted or somebody paying to have sex with a young girl or somebody not, protecting people that are under their jurisdiction. This is about our democracy. This is about future generations of Americans that deserve to have liberty and justice for all. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hadn't intended to ask any questions, but I will confess Mr. Gates's recitation of issues struck a chord with me. I've been concerned about what I see on television, where it appears that there is a criminalization of dissent occurring. And then the current president, appeared to endorse that on a widely reported interview that he gave. And we do need to be careful. We're the people's house. We are where people come together to debate the big issues of the day, figure out how to spend the people's money. But the criminalization of dissent is it's a major concern to me. And I do worry about the direction we're going with some of the things I'm seeing, even at school board meetings where people are being told that they can't speak or it's inappropriate. I also, if I accept the assumption that this isn't about last summer, this is about everything that happened on January 6th on, we don't ever ask any questions about the automobile attack on the gate, where a policeman lost his life on Good Friday. We don't talk about protesters taking over Department of Interior. I mean, these are all recent events that happened in the case of the Department of Interior, within the past week. Where are the headlines? Where are the stories? Where are the calls for investigation? They simply do not seem to be occurring. So forgive me if I'm looking at these activities today as being somewhat politicized and one-sided, but Mr. Gates, I did want to let you know I concur with your concern about the criminalization of what should be normal political speech and criminalization of dissent. And free to comment, yes, sir.
I thank the gentleman, and I would start by saying that I also value the lives of my Democrat colleagues, particularly the gentlelady from California, and I think everybody's glad that nobody was hurt, and I don't think there's a single Republican that wished that anyone lost their life or was harmed in any way. And, you know, to Mr. Chairman's comments, in light of what Mr. Burgess said, this doesn't strike me as an eagerness for the truth as much as it strikes me as an eagerness for a prosecution, for the utilization of criminal process. And this is just one step along the way, not for the truth, but to get prosecutions going of people that are political opponents. I agree with the chairman that we never want anything like January 6th to happen again. I think that is a valuable and virtuous goal, but I reject the premise that the process we're going through now makes that less likely. Matter of fact, I think that when you have circumstances where we violate all sense of process and protocol to remove the minority leaders, chosen members of the committee, when we utilize preservation demands against the phone records of members of Congress and then have leaks illuminate that rather than giving people due process and the rule of law, which Congresswoman Torres spoke eloquently about, I don't think that any of this is moving us away from another violent event. I think, as a matter of fact, these hyper-partisan, questionable efforts that are so unprecedented may actually animate more violence on the right and the left, and that would be yet another failure of our institutions that no member, Republican or Democrat, would ever want to see. I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Yeah, let me just again remind everybody here, just what I said at the previous panel, that there was a genuine attempt at a truly bipartisan commission. I inserted the record of the Republican leader. All the demands that he had made were acceded to, and that was rejected.
How does that inform on removing his people on the committee as it's informed now?
If in fact we could have moved that forward, the minority leader could have appointed you or Mr. Jordan or whoever else he wanted to be on that commission. The reality was...
So you're punishing him for it?
No, the reality was that basically it became clear that that amongst the leadership, there was no interest in getting to the truth, that there was only an interest in obstruction and sabotage. And so we had to move forward in a different way, not the way we wanted to.
Do you think it's helpful to say that because McCarthy didn't
live up to what you believed his commitments are, you're going to punish due process as an institution and the rule of law by removing Banks and Jordan from the committee?
We embraced due process, but we're interested in getting to the truth, Mr. Gates. And and there's a difference. And there's the difference. I think we are at odds on that. Mr. Perlmutter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Listening to Mr. Jordan and Mr. Gates reminded me of old law school kind of statement. If you don't have the facts, argue the law. If you don't have the law, baffle them with bull. And I'd have to say to my friends, Mr. Gates and Mr. Jordan, I've never heard such an effort to obfuscate the question that we have before us. And I could only think of the word sophistry, which is the use of fallacious or specious arguments, especially with the intent to deceive. And I don't say that lightly, because these guys are my friends. I work with them on things. But I am very disappointed. And I'd say to Mr. Jordan, what happened on January 6th, that was a direct attack on liberty. That was a direct attack on freedom. That was a direct attack on people's right to vote. And the subpoena that the committee has issued has been ignored and defied. And the committee is within full rights. This Congress is within its full rights to demand the truth from Mr. Bannon, to demand that he appear. If he chooses, Mr. Gates, to plead the Fifth Amendment, that's his prerogative. But he doesn't have the prerogative to defy a subpoena as he has done. And so I'm going to be voting for this rule, and I yield back to the chair.
Thank you. Mr. Reschenthaler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Perlmutter was referencing law school. Mr. Perlmutter, if the bar knew how many days I skied my 3L year, they'd probably revoke my law license. And I know that you would probably appreciate that comment more than anybody. So there's been a lot said here today. But I think that really what we should focus on is just the issue, and that is that's looking at the case law. So we know that congressional subpoenas must address a valid legislative purpose and be related to and in furtherance of a legitimate task of Congress. So if you look at the case law, I'd say that's the only thing we should be looking at. It's a very narrow topic. Mr. Jordan, would you like to apply the facts as you see them to that narrow legal topic?
Yeah, we've said this from the get-go that it seems to me the appropriate questions to be asking are the lack of a proper security presence that day. Why weren't we prepared? Why weren't we ready? That's a legitimate legislative purpose, legitimate oversight function of the government, not what we see the committee engaging in now. That's where we should be focused. I think that's the reason Republicans weren't allowed to be on the committee, because we were raising those questions. And frankly, the only one that can truly answer those is the Speaker of the House. She's the one who has ultimate authority over the Sergeant of Arms. And she's the one who's in control. But that's not where they want to go. They want to go on this obsession with President Trump, this obsession with going after people, even though the FBI is doing the investigation, and the FBI said there was no conspiracy, but they are prosecuting people who did wrong. And that's exactly what it should be. 600 of them, over 600 of them. So that's what we want. I would, if I could, to the gentleman, just point out the previous member said fallacious here's the quote he used, fallacious arguments with intent to deceive. This is, you almost would laugh. I mean, for 4 years, we had the Trump-Russia collusion argument. 4 years of it. Spent $30 million. Bob Mueller come back and said there was nothing, no collusion, no conspiracy. They told us the dossier was real. They told us the Hunter Biden story was false. We now know, of course, it was true. They knew it was true at the time. We knew it was true at the time. They've actually told us in the past few months the border is secure. Mayorkas stood there and said the border is secure. Like, are you kidding me? And of course, they've said for 4 years that Hillary Clinton won the 2016 election. So they're allowed to say all that fallacious. They're allowed to make all those fallacious arguments with intent to deceive the American people, but we're not allowed to raise questions and concerns when over half the electorate had questions and concerns about the 2020 election.
Thanks, Mr. Jordan. I appreciate it. There's a
Mr.
really,
Reschthal, may I answer that question regarding the legal test?
I yield back. Right, sure.
Yeah, I think the real question there is whether or not setting up a criminal referral is a legitimate action of the Congress, right? Because you heard Chair Thompson and Congresswoman Cheney give up the game that this is all about setting up criminal process. So if it is an appropriate action for the Congress to engage in in committee work for the sole purpose of criminal referrals, then this would be under that purview. But there's a reason why the founders did not vest in the Congress criminal prosecution authorities, because to establish that balance of power, that requirement and that obligation resides elsewhere. So applying the legal test to the Bannon question, I think really does ripen the fact that this is about criminal process, not about oversight, not about legislation. And to reflect on the point Mr. Jordan made in responding to your question, the sophistry is that we're doing this in the first place. Is there a single American who believes that if the Democrats had a reconciliation deal and an infrastructure bill that we would be doing this week? Absolutely not. They'd be working on the legislative promises that they've made to constituents, but they can't get a bill. They can't deliver for the people. And so all of this January 6th obsession is the sophistry. And I yield back.
Thanks, Mr. Gates. I appreciate it. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Raskin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, the first thing I wanted to say was to you, Mr. Chairman, you know, you acted very bravely on the evening of January 6th. You took the lectern, you took the dais after Speaker Pelosi and the Democratic and Republican leaders were escorted off of the floor, and you have not been sufficiently noted for what you did in keeping us going during that pivotal moment, and you were the last member to leave the House of Representatives, and you were very close to the scene where the insurrectionists were trying to break into the House of Representatives. So I just want to acknowledge that and acknowledge your courage in acting that night. Mr. Gates, welcome to the Rules Committee. It's good to see you.
Good to see you again.
One thing I do think I want to correct is that Chairman Thompson and Vice Chair Cheney never said that the purpose of this was to bring criminal referrals, that the purpose of the investigation was the purpose of the investigation is to get to the truth of the causes and the events constituting the attack on Congress and on the Capitol. So the purpose of this particular action is to coerce compliance by Steve Bannon, who is the only person out there who thinks that he's above the law. Now, but by all means, you can respond to that.
I would suggest using a phrase Mr. Bannon uses quite frequently, catch the signal, not the noise. The signal in the testimony from Chair Thompson and Ms. Cheney referenced criminal contempt and Mr. McCarthy's especially active efforts to block the committee. So I think that the signal they are sending is that that's the direction they want to go.
Catch the signal, not the noise. Okay. And you started off by saying that we're more concerned, I think, about Steve Bannon's podcast than we are about the truth of January 6th. I didn't know Steve Bannon had a podcast. Apparently...
well, did you listen to the statements of the...
I didn't know that that's where they were drawn from.
He referenced them in his opening.
Well, I knew that Steve Bannon was repeatedly saying on January 5th that all hell is going to break loose tomorrow. We are closing in on the target. He was saying it's unlike anything that you're going to expect, and so on.
Very similar to other political rhetoric.
Okay, fair enough. But here's the point. Let's just speak for real, if we could, Mr. Gates.
Only way I do it.
You've been on Steve Bannon's podcast 3 different times.
I think way more than 3.
Okay, at least 3 times that I could find just by Googling it here. So the only person mentioning Steve Bannon's podcast is you.
No, that's not true. The chairman actually mentioned it in his opening.
Okay, then I missed it. He was mentioning statements. He wasn't advertising the podcast or his slogan or whatever. But here's the question I want to ask you. Let's just start with basics. Do you accept that Joe Biden won the 2020 presidential election?
I accept that Joe Biden is the president.
Do you accept that he won the election by more than 7 million votes and defeated Donald Trump by 306 to 232 in the Electoral College, a margin that Donald Trump called a landslide when he beat Hillary Clinton by the same numbers?
I think that our election was uniquely polluted by these indiscriminate mail-in ballots. I think that this was the first time in America's history where the mailbox beat the ballot box.
Do you think there's any evidence that there was electoral corruption or fraud that materially altered the outcome of the presidential election, and where is that evidence?
I believe that had mail ballots not been sent to people who had not requested them, that Donald Trump would be sitting behind the Resolute desk.
Okay, but you don't think that there is, legally speaking, I know you're a lawyer because you went to the great law school, William & Mary. Legally speaking, there was no election fraud or no election corruption. Well, let's put it this way. Do you agree that 61 different federal and state courts, including 8 judges that Donald Trump appointed himself to the federal bench, have rejected every claim of electoral corruption or fraud that have been advanced? Do you agree with that?
I don't, and the reason is those claims are not evaluated because in many of the circumstances you reference, jurisdiction was the principal question. So I think it requires a review of the procedure.
Do you have any case authority in the land of those 61 cases or any other cases where a court has determined that there was electoral corruption or electoral fraud that materially affected the outcome of an election in any state in the union?
No court.
Do you have one?
Which I believe is a real failure of the judiciary. I think the Article III courts failed our country by not exercising more jurisdiction over those questions. Now, there's a difference in whether or not fraud existed and whether or not there's an adequate remedy, and I think also a number of those cases were kicked on remedies.
No court has said that fraud existed, and so there's no remedy because there's no violation, Mr. Gates.
Right, but you cannot
there's no violation, there's no fraud.
Decided that there was no fraud if they didn't take up the question and review the facts on jurisdiction or remedy.
You know what? That might work on Steve Bannon's podcast, but that's not going to work in the Rules Committee of the United States House of Representatives. I'm sorry, Mr. Gates, forgive me. I've got some serious questions to ask you. The chairman of the January 6th committee, Chairman Thompson, and John Katko, who was the emissary of Kevin McCarthy, negotiated an agreement for an independent outside commission with 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, equal subpoena power, right down the middle. And yet Donald Trump decided he didn't like it because he doesn't want anybody investigating January the 6th. So he turned against it, and then the Republican leadership flipped over and turned against it. I think you voted against that commission. Why did you vote against that commission?
For many of the reasons that I've discussed today, that the focus on January 6th, the obsession
so you don't want to know.
Is unwarranted.
You don't want to know anymore.
Look, I think we have.
Okay, let me ask you about that.
We have a process in Article 3 where the courts get to determine those issues. If the United States government brings charges, people can resolve those in the courts.
You don't want to know.
That's not okay with you guys because you want
Mr.
to politicize it because you.
I know you too well for this. You don't want to know the answer. You don't want to know. So let me, Mr. Gates, let me ask you. Let me ask you a serious question.
The stenographer is trying to take people's words down, and she can't if everybody talks over each other. Okay. So
our apologies to the stenographer. Okay. We're going to do it civilly, like 2 lawyers. Okay, Mr. Gates, let me ask you this. Let's say that the exact same attack had taken place. Let's assume 145 of our officers were beaten in the face with baseball bats, steel pipes, Confederate battle flags, etc. Let's say they interrupted the counting of electoral college votes for the first time in American history for 4 or 5 hours. Let's say marauders, insurrectionists came into our building and chanted for hanging Vice President Mike Pence. But let's just change the hypothetical. This one element, Mr. Gates. Let's say it wasn't the Proud Boys. Let's say it wasn't the Oath Keepers. Let's say it wasn't the 3 Percenters. Let's say it wasn't the Aryan Nations. Let's say it was Al-Qaeda or ISIS. Would you really not want an investigation into what happened with that attack on America?
If Al-Qaeda or ISIS attacked the U.S. Capitol, I would think that the least capable institution to bring them to justice would be this January 6th committee.
You would not want...
I would far prefer the legal process to play out or the military process to play out. If the American people had to rely on the Congress itself as an institution to protect us from ISIS, without law enforcement, without the military, we would be in deep, deep trouble.
Okay, is that a new position for you and Mr. Jordan? Because I know you guys
have been involved... It's a new hypothetical.
Yeah, you've been involved in a lot of different investigations, both of you. For example, does Benghazi ring a bell?
I was, I believe, a law student at the Great William and Mary Law School.
All right. Well, but before I come to Mr. Jordan, let me ask you this. Do you think that people who are subpoenaed by a court or by the United States Congress, who think in their head that they might have a privilege or someone else might have a privilege, have the right just not to show up?
I believe that people have the right to allow the legal process to
Okay,
resolve whether
but you
or
know
not
how that
they're
works, Mr.
obligated
Gates.
to
You're a
appear.
lawyer. You know how that
Very
works.
much so.
You
You
show
know
up.
it works too.
Wait a second,
You know
Mr.
that-
Gates. Wait, hold on. Let's try to educate the public here.
Please.
Because people need to know. If you're subpoenaed, you go. If you think you have a privilege, for example, let's say Steve Bannon says, you know what, I'm guilty as hell. I don't want to testify against myself. In America, you don't have to. The Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination says, I plead the Fifth. I might incriminate myself, but you know what? You got to go. And you got to answer each specific question. Some of them might implicate your Fifth Amendment rights, and some of them might not. Even if he thinks he's got, in some surreal parallel universe, a presidential executive privilege, even though he didn't even work for the White House at that point. He'd been fired by Donald Trump in August of 2017. This is in January of 2021, in December of 2020. But even if he thought that, he's got to come before the committee and he has to plead it. Do you not agree with that?
I think that...
No, honestly, do you not agree with that?
Mr.
Yeah.
Raskin, I allowed you to speak and I didn't interrupt you. I hope I'm given the same opportunity.
Just give me the honest answer.
The honest answer is that the McGahn litigation that you and I both followed closely as members of the Judiciary Committee actually is the path forward. McGahn didn't have to show up to assert that he was waiting for legal...
The president asserted executive privilege on his behalf.
Now you're the one giving challenges to the stenographer. So,
no, I'm telling you, wait a second. I'm going to elaborate on your answer here.
But I haven't even given my full answer yet.
That's not how it works in the Rules Committee, Mr. Gates. Just follow this then.
Well, wait,
the president.
do I get to respond to these?
Mr. Gates, I'm going to give you the chance to respond.
Well, it doesn't
respond
sound like it. Sounds like you
President
monologue
Trump
and then they
asserted
complain about the
executive privilege.
stenographer if I respond.
President Trump asserted executive privilege for McGahn. President Biden has not asserted.
I believe there is.
Has not asserted executive privilege.
President Trump has initiated litigation. Look, the reason you all waited on McGahn is because the Russia hoax wasn't going well for you. And the reason you're not waiting now is because you have no other legislation or other solutions for the country.
All right,
That's why
Mr. Jordan, let me switch to you.
You had the McGahn playbook, but you've ditched it because you guys need January 6th so bad.
Okay, Mr. Jordan, let me come to you. You're a lawyer too, right?
Nope.
Okay, I thought you got in law school.
I went to law school, never took the bar exam.
Oh, gotcha.
Sat for
Okay,
the bar exam.
gotcha. My dad never took the bar either. So, do you oppose the use of criminal contempt charges against people who refuse to testify before Congress?
No, we've used it. I mean, we contempt Lois Lerner after a year of hearings and investigation.
You sure did, didn't you? You said
Lois
the U.S.
Lerner.
attorney had a legal duty to go to the grand jury, didn't you?
Well, it says shall. When the Congress voted for contempt, it says shall go to the grand jury. That U.S. attorney didn't.
That's right. And
He
you
didn't
also
go.
said the U.S. attorney unilaterally decided to ignore the will of the House of Representatives.
It's true.
You said Mr. Manchin was legally bound to convene a grand jury, but indeed he ignored his obligation and unilaterally decided to ignore the will of the House of Representatives. Don't you think it's important that when we're exercising our Article I powers to get the evidence we need in order to legislate, that people obey the subpoenas of the United States House of Representatives? You used to believe that, Mr. Jordan. Do you no longer believe that?
Once a legitimate investigation, sure.
All right.
Sure.
In 2012, the Oversight Committee approved a resolution holding Attorney General Holder in contempt of Congress. Do you remember that one?
Say it again. I was thinking how I was going to elaborate on the answer when you cut me off to ask me the question again, please.
Well, continue, Mr. Jordan, because everybody's always violating your rights, so I'm going to give you all the time you want.
No one's violating my rights.
Okay. Well, look, let me remind you what you said when Attorney General Holder was held in criminal contempt of Congress. We simply want the facts. Because Attorney General Eric Holder will not provide what the law requires, we are left with no other option except to hold him in contempt. We're doing the exact same thing, Mr. Jordan.
No, we're
with
not.
all the bluster about the border and all the other nonsense you're talking about, Russia and everything. We are holding him in contempt for violating a subpoena of the United States House of Representatives.
There wasn't some special select committee that Republicans were not permitted to serve on that issued those subpoenas. That's not the case.
All right, well, let's
This
came
close
from
with
the
this.
Oversight
Mr.
Committee.
Jordan,
Why
and the
did you vote
Judiciary
against
Committee.
the commission of 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats equals subpoena power? Why did you oppose that? Are you also not interested in what happened to us on January 6th?
Of course, everyone is interested in holding people accountable who did wrong. The FBI is doing that. The Justice Department is doing that appropriately. So what I'm not interested
So why
in
did you have all
is
those
a politically
Benghazi investigations if you don't
motivated
think Congress
investigation.
should be investigating?
Because Hillary Clinton misled the American people.
Mr.
She
Chairman,
said
I
she
yield
didn't
back
wanna-
to you. I yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
If you want to...
And Hillary testified, by the way, before the United States House of Representatives for how many hours?
9 hours, I
Yeah.
think.
I also
10
just
hours?
want to say for the record, I mean, the Mueller report gets brought up, and people keep on saying that Mueller found nothing in regards to Russia. Because the historical record to be clear here, that the 448-page Mueller report actually contains copious details about how Russia interfered in the 2016 election. So I
Sounds
just,
like an insurrection, Mr. Chairman.
but I think it's important for that fact to be made clear. Ms. Fishbach.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Chair, I don't have any questions. I just, I'm a little disappointed in the fact that it has become the custom to really go after and put our colleagues who come to testify on trial here. And I thought that we were here to speak about a very specific resolution, and I would hope that our conversation would stay to that. But thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Yeah, I was hoping it would stay on that subject too, but we covered a lot of different territory here. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too am trying to catch the signal, not the noise. So the Rules Committee is here to consider a resolution to find Steve Bannon in contempt for refusing to comply with a congressional subpoena to testify about what he knows about the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Am I correct, Mr. Jordan, that you are here because you oppose finding of the resolution to find Steve Bannon in contempt of the congressional subpoena?
Yes.
Okay, how about you, Mr. Gates? Are you here because you oppose finding Steve Bannon in the resolution to find Steve Bannon in contempt?
Yes, and I think that's because he hasn't actively defied it so much as he's asked for a question of law to be resolved.
So you disagree with the underlying facts, perhaps. Mr. Jordan, in passing, you also mentioned that you object to the January 6th committee subpoenaing organizers of the January 6th rally about whether they spoke with members of Congress about the rally or the attack on the Capitol. Is that right?
Yeah, I pointed out in my opening
Okay, I
statement.
can
You got
see
11
why you might
individuals
think
whose
that.
names on some application, and then they're going to get called in, deposed. Many of them are 20-some-year-old staffers.
And some of them actually organized the rally with the White House. I do appreciate the fact that both of you have acknowledged here today that Joe Biden is the president, although I find your repeated endorsement of demonstrably false conspiracy theories about the 2020 election to be both uninformed and unpatriotic. But I appreciate that you both did acknowledge that Joe Biden is the president. I have to assume you also acknowledge that former presidents lose the power to pardon once they leave office. Would that be correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Morelli.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. I don't have any questions, but I do find, I think, the characterization of it as an assault on their First Amendment rights simply by asking people information about that they may have that may be relevant to an investigation about attacks on the United States Capitol to be sort of extraordinary. I gather, and I'm no expert in this, that every single day in America, law enforcement and people ask folks in all manner of investigations for information. I don't know that I've ever heard it described as an attack, an assault on First Amendment rights. I think, we have to balance interests always, certainly, but I think asking for information that may be relevant, and there's no suggestion that the committee has just gone through the phone book to inquire or to ask information. People, I notice a lot of members don't know how to control their volume button on this committee. We may have to have a technical session.
That wasn't me this time.
No disrespect meant to the gentleman from Oklahoma either.
Yeah, I apologize.
No, I struggle with it myself. I would include myself in that instruction. But I've not heard that described, and so I'm not sure what the assault on First Amendment's rights, that seems to be a big deal, but I haven't heard anything here that indicates that any such assault exists. I also, and I'll just close with this, I've also not heard a single rationale why Mr. Bannon should not be compelled to testify before the congressional committee. There's a section of the U.S. Code, which we've talked about, which suggests that you have to answer a subpoena. I think my colleagues who are learned members of the bar have discussed what happens in the case of a subpoena when you assert certain privileges, that there are standards to be followed. I haven't heard anyone say why he shouldn't. And frankly, not sure what the sanction would be. If people just decided to ignore the Congress and to ignore subpoenas and there was no sanction available, what would we do? So should we stop holding oversight hearings? Should we stop convening? Should we stop issuing subpoenas? Because once this happens, Mr. Bannon is successful in not having his testimony compelled, I'm not sure what that would say for the party of law and order to suggest that somehow ignoring subpoenas by the Congress of the United States is something that can be routinely done. I'm not sure that there's any point in us ever holding a hearing again or ever issuing subpoenas to compel information or testimony to come forward. And frankly, one of the most important fundamental issues we've ever confronted, which is a physical, violent assault on the United States Capitol. I'm almost at a loss for words to understand, but I just go back to it. I haven't heard a single thing. I've heard a lot of conversation here, a lot of going back and forth. I've not heard a single rationale why Mr. Bannon should, and frankly, if he doesn't know anything, comes forward and says, I don't know it. I have no information at all. Okay. I'm not sure why you wouldn't just do that, but clearly, because there's other issues here that have nothing to do with rights or assertions of executive privilege. This is the politics of Steve Bannon. I get it, and wants to be a controversial figure, and he's managed to get pardons before. Maybe he figures somebody will pardon him in the future. I don't know, but I'll support the underlying rule and the resolution. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. DeSagne. Here. Ms. Ross.
I have no further questions, and I'm even more committed to my vote for the rule and the resolution.
Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I don't want to belabor the point. Two particular things that I guess I wanted to just raise, both of which I think Mr. Raskin touched on. First, I understand if folks want to distinguish the facts of prior instances of contempt citations that have been issued by the Congress versus today. I get that. But I would hope that folks would spare me and spare the committee these hollow arguments about criminalization of these proceedings. And for precisely the reasons Representative Raskin noted, I was not here in 2012 when the Congress approved a contempt citation against former Attorney General Eric Holder, but the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee certainly was, as was the ranking member of the Rules Committee, both of whom voted in favor of it. I was not here in 2014 when Lois Lerner was held in contempt by the Congress, but again, I say that many other members of this committee and those who are testifying today certainly were and are fully aware that the Congress has used this tool in the past. So that's just first and foremost, I think, important context. Secondly, my colleague from Florida noted my phrase of complete and total defiance and took issue with that characterization. It is undoubtedly complete and total defiance for precisely the reason that Representative Raskin noted, which is to say, if Mr. Bannon believes that there are immunities or privileges available to him that he wishes to assert, he is welcome to come and testify before the Select Committee and assert those privileges, as any other witness is able to do. If he believes that there are documents that he has in his possession that are protected by executive privilege, he is welcome to work with his counsel to identify those documents and produce a privilege log attesting to that fact, and in addition, produce the remainder of the documents which are not subject to the privilege. But we heard from Chairman Thompson and Vice Chair Cheney very clearly is that this particular witness has chosen to do none of those things. Instead, he's chosen to simply say, I will not participate in any interview, in any deposition, in any testimony. I won't produce any documents. That is defiance of the subpoena, and it's precisely why we're considering the resolution that we're considering today, and certainly why I'll be supporting it. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. No further questions. Let me just say, that our meeting here today really was about one thing, and that's getting to the truth about what happened on January 6th. And we heard a lot of bluster. We heard a lot of talk about all kinds of things, some totally unrelated to what we're talking about here today. But that's not what I'm going to remember most about this hearing today. And what I'm going to remember most is that before this panel, we had a chair and a vice chair, a Democrat and a Republican, sit there and despite disagreeing on virtually every single issue under the sun, came together in support of defending our democracy. And I think what they did was is what patriots do, what public servants do, and what it's about putting our country before party. And I'm worried. I think a lot of us are worried about the future, about our future, about the state of our democracy. But actually, moments like we witnessed earlier actually fill me with hope. I wish more of our colleagues would join them, and I look at this not as an opportunity to defend one person, but to defend something greater, this Congress, the Constitution, and our democracy. So I appreciate both of you being here, and you are free to go. And anybody else wanting to testify? Hearing none, then that closes the hearing portion, and I now will yield to the gentlelady from California and entertain a motion from the gentlewoman, Mrs. Torres.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee provide for consideration of the resolution accompanying House Report 117-152 under a closed rule. The rule provides that if House Report 117-152 is called up by direction of the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol, all points of order against the report shall be waived and it shall be considered as read. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided among and controlled by Representative Thompson of Mississippi, Representative Cheney of Wyoming, and an opponent or their respective designees. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the resolution accompanying the report. Finally, the rule provides that the resolution accompanying the report shall be considered as read.
And I want to thank the gentleman for her motion. But before we go to a vote, I just want to recognize that this will be the last and the final Rules Committee meeting for our digital director, Mary Lieb, who is leaving this week. Many of us are used to seeing her here taking photos during our meetings. She's here. Where did she go? Oh, there she is, right there in front of me. Right. Okay. But there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, as we all know, and she has been invaluable as we transitioned to remote committee work at the height of the COVID pandemic, and she helped many other committees too. She's not done yet because we're putting her to work reading the roll today. But Mary, I think I speak for all of us here when I say that we're going to miss you and we wish you all the best. And from the bottom of our hearts, we thank you for your service here. So thank you. And with that, the vote is now on the motion from the gentlewoman from California. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed?
No.
No. Continue the chair. The ayes have it. A recorded vote has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Perlmutter?
Aye.
Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Raskin? Mr. Raskin?
I vote aye.
Mr. Raskin, aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon, aye. Mr. Morelli?
Aye.
Mr. Morelli, aye. Mr. DeSaulnier?
Aye.
Mr. DeSaulnier, aye. Ms. Ross?
Aye.
Ms. Ross, aye. Mr. Neguse?
Aye.
Mr. Neguse, aye. Mr. Cole?
No.
Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Rushenthaler?
No.
Mr. Rushenthaler, no. Ms. Fishbach?
No.
Ms. Fishbach, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk, report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to. I will carry this for the Democrats.
And Ms. Fishbach will carry it to the Republicans.
And so without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you.
You're going to expect another meeting?
No, I hope not.